So with her hand raised to her heart, this miniature really encapsulates the sort of romance and intimacy of portrait miniatures, and that is what really has drawn collectors to them for centuries. And that is also why this miniature has been in some of the most important collections of portrait miniatures in British history. The sitter was Venetia Stanley, Lady Digby, and she was brought up in a strict Roman Catholic household. However, her early life was slightly overshadowed by rumours of love affairs. She then later married a courtier called Sir Kenelm Digby, but then she sadly died unexpectedly in her sleep when she was aged just only 33. What then followed was a campaign by her husband to record her likeness in seemingly every form of imagery available to him. He asked Anthony van Dyck to paint her on her deathbed. He commissioned portraits by miniaturists to memorialise her in little. I mean, this particular miniature derives from a miniature by Isaac Oliver, which we think was painted in around 1614. This specific work was painted by an artist of the next generation. However, that really just shows how the romance of her life and her story carried from one generation to the next. For many years, this miniature was actually misidentified as a portrait of Lady Arabella Stuart, who was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth I and a romantic figure from the late Elizabethan period. And in fact, it was only recently that this new identification has been proposed. So this work was, we know, owned by a former Prime Minister called Lord Wilmington, and after that it entered the collection of none other than Horace Walpole, who was probably the most famous collector of miniatures in the 18th century. It then subsequently passed through the hands of other collectors and it ended up in the ownership of Pierpont Morgan, who was probably the greatest collector of miniatures of the late 19th, early 20th century. It was then sold after he died, and it was from there that Walter Samuel, Viscount Bearsted, acquired it. And it was in his collection and the collection of his descendants until only recently.